All living things are highly organized. Animals begin their life as a single cell, which is the fertilized egg, also called as the zygote. The zygote undergoes cell divisions from mitosis that we have talked about earlier, and the cells then differentiate into a variety of tissues that will later give a structure to various organs, and eventually organs will form the organ system. We sort of reviewed this in the beginning of the semester. In this chapter, we will consider the concept of tissue, organ, and organ system levels of organization. So the first thing we want to understand are the types of tissue, and mainly what is a tissue. A tissue is composed of specialized cells of the same type that perform a common function in the body. There are the four major types of tissues that are found in the animal kingdom, and especially our focus is right now in the humans. I'm going to use a lot of the examples of human body tissue types and different systems. The first tissue is the epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue covers all the body surface. It also lines the body cavities, for example, in the stomach, in the GI, in the lungs, the cavities that surround the different systems, and the outside covering. And in some cases, it also forms a few specialized glands that we will talk about. The second kind of tissue is the connective tissue. The connective tissue, as the name tells you, it connects and binds and supports various body parts. Next is the muscular tissue, which helps to help us move, whether our hands or limbs or all kinds of muscles in our body and its parts. And lastly is the nervous tissue, which receives stimulus from the environment and transmits the nerve impulses. So this is generally the four types of tissue. So now we will look at the characteristics of the first kind of tissue, which is the epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue, as it's called, it's slightly tightly packed cells that form a continuous layer. And I'll show you some images in the next coming slide so you can see how tightly the packed cells are. But it's a continuous layer. So, for example, our skin is not broken in pieces. It's all continuous. It usually, as I said earlier, it covers the surfaces and also the body cavities. Usually, it has the main function of the epithelial tissue is to provide protection from the environment outside, and within the body cavity, it also prevents solutions to move from one system to the other. So it has a sort of like a boundary role. It can be modified, and we'll talk about the modifications that it has. The epithelial tissue is also a cell-rich tissue, which means that it has plenty of blood supply, that we will see how it gets a continuous supply of blood, plasma, and so forth. It's avascular, which means it does not really directly have its own blood supply. It actually receives blood through diffusion or absorption of the blood. It has a cell which is called as a basal or an apical set, and that's important when we talk about the body cavity and how we will distinguish the epithelial tissue in the body cavity, because it has a basal end and it has an apical end to it, so which is called as a polar cell, because it has two different shapes on the cell. And it's got what is called as the basement membrane. Basement membrane, epithelial cells are exposed, for example, on the outside to the environment. So if these were epithelial cells, then the outside would be the environment that it's exposed to, and below it would be the basement membrane. The basement membrane we should not get it confused with the plasma membrane or the body membranes. It's actually a thin layer of various tissue types of proteins that actually help anchor the epithelium to the connective tissue. So you will have the connective tissue later on. So it actually is more like a glue between the two. We'll talk about the cell shapes in the coming slides too, but let's just give you a quick one. Squamous are cells that are more square-looking cells. So if you do a transverse section, these cells are going to look like boxes, and they're all over. They're usually simply found, example, in the lining of the lungs and blood vessels, and they're protective. There are also cells that line the inner body cavity, for example, the kidney tubules. And so if I was to do a transverse section, and this was the body cavity, which is the opening, also called as the lumen, the cells surrounding these are also epithelium, and these cells are usually also cuboidal in shape. So here are your cuboidal shapes. Here is the squamous, which is, for example, as I said, in the lungs. And the columnar cells, as the name tells you, they're more like columns. They are simple, straight shape, and they're usually present in intestines. And all of these, both the cuboidal and the columnar, these two are mainly used for absorption. The main function of these cells are absorption, and the main function for squamous cells is protection. And let's look at some of the images, because my drawings are not very nice, as you can see pretty much. So here are the different kinds of the epithelium I was talking about. Here's the ones that are present in the linings of the lungs, and you can see how they are they're sort of like cuboidal in shapes and so forth. So these are the simple squamous cells, and these are the stratified squamous. Now the term simple and stratified, let's go into it. As you can see, the simple cells have only one layer that is present over here, while the stratified are multi-layered. And the stratified squamous are present in the linings of our nose, mouth, esophagus, vagina. And again, the main function of the squamous cells are that they're usually protective, and that's the main purpose. The glandular epithelium cells are those that have these epithelium cells actually produce a product, and it's supposed to be a glandular. For example, the sweat glands. A gland is simply a single epithelium cell, and it releases certain mucus with content. And there can be exocrine glands, and there can be endocrine glands. The exocrine glands are, for example, are your sweat glands. They manufacture and produce their product into the blood, and they release to the surface of the skin and nails. The endocrine gland are the ones that release hormones, and they then release the hormones that will that also diffuse into the bloods. And they, for example, insulin that is diffused into the bloodstream are examples of the secretion of glandular epithelium. So this concludes our first one. Let's go on to the next type. So we actually did this part. Okay, I'm mixing up my slides. Okay, we have done this one. Let's go on. Here, I just had my slides in the wrong order. Now let's talk about the connective tissue. The connective tissue, and I'm going to show you some slides of the connective tissue because there's so much variation in the connective tissues. But the connective tissue is the most abundant and the widely distributed tissue in the multicellular animal. It is very diverse in structure and function. So there are all kinds and all types of these. They have three components. One is called as the specialized cell. Then we have the ground substance. I'm going to circle them. The specialized cells, the ground substance, and the protein fibers. For example, these are the protein fibers. And these would be, for example, an adipose would be a specialized cell. So these cells, the ground substance is actually, this is the non-cellular, come on, close. Okay, we missed something over here. This is the non-cellular material, and it separates the cells and the various consistency from solid to semi-solid to fluid. The fibers the fibers are of very importance. There are three different kinds of fibers. You can have the collagen fibers, that will release collagen, a protein that gives flexibility and strength. The reticular fibers that are very thin, and they're very thin collagen fibers and highly branched. That's how you recognize these. And the elastic fibers that contains elastin, which is something that will give more elasticity to these cells. So these are it's called as it's a matrix. It's very rich because it will have any of one of the collagen, elastin, or reticular fibers in them. They're vascular, which means that they have their own blood supply directly to these connective tissue. For example, bone will have its own blood plasma that will draw to it. It has less cell, I should say, because we don't see the cell as much as you see the matrix around it. So it's called as the cell pore. And let's see, did we forget something here? Yeah, the reticular fibers, an example would be also fibers that are present in spleen or that are used for filtration. Now, something else that is important to understand with connective tissue is that names of the connective tissue will either end in site or blast. Blast is the immature. So this is the immature cell, and the site is the mature cell. So if you see, for example, osteocyte and osteoblast, osteocyte would be the mature cell and osteoblast would be the immature cell. Along with the connective tissues, they also have the white blood cells that will engulf the pathogens and produce antibodies in here. So these are just some of the matrix components of the connective tissue. Let's look at some more types of connective tissue, because as I said, there's a lot of variation in the connective tissue. They can be loose or very dense fiber connective tissues, and those are called as, for example, the fibroblast. Now, we'll go through the different names: adipose, loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, cartilage, bone, and blood, because they're all different types of connective tissue. So let's begin with the adipose tissue. The adipose is as the name tells, comes from the word fatty. They serve as the body's primary energy reservoir. Adipose tissue also insulates the body, and it controls the temperature, also provides cushion to the vital organs. So for example, heart, or around the kidney or the lungs, you'll find a lot of adipose tissue there. Adipose cells in an individual are usually fixed. So for example, when we gain weight, the cells become larger, and when we lose weight, the cells become shrink or smaller in size. So you don't really increase the number of cells, which is good, because I would not like to have more of these cells. You can control the fat that is present within the cells. And in very large people or obese people, the individual cells are called as adipocytes, and they can be 5 times larger than normal cells. Most of the adipose tissue is white fat, but they may have some brown fat in there too, which is slightly rich in mitochondria. If you have a little bit of brown fat, it's better to give you more heat, or it's usually like a heater in the cells. So that's all about the functions and the presence of adipose tissue. Sometimes, for example, in this image, you can see how much fat is present, that it actually pushes the nucleus to one side. So all this component in here is the fat, and the nucleus is pushed to one side. It's more like a cushiony or filled in cell. The next kind of cell is the loose connective tissue. excuse me, the loose connective tissue supports epithelium and also has many internal organs. Its presence in, for example, arteries and bladder and lungs, and it allows these organs to expand. So it has a elasticity in there. So if it has elasticity, you can pretty be sure that it has more of the elastin fibers in within that. It also forms a protective covering enclosing many internal organs, also such as the muscles, blood vessels, and nerve cells that are supplying to this region. So, excuse me, that was all about the loose connective tissue. Now, the dense connective tissue contains many kinds of protein fibers, mainly collagen fibers, and they're highly packed. This type of tissue is more specific function than the loose connective tissue. For example, dense fibrous connective tissue is found in tendons, which connects the muscles to the bones, and in ligaments, which connects bones to other bones or joints. So make sure you know the difference between, let's say, tendon and a ligament. Tendons are connections of tissues that connect muscles to the bone. Excuse me. Got a cough today when I'm recording. I might not record the whole thing. And the ligament, which will connect bones to other bones. So you have a bone to another bone joined through ligaments, which are wider bands. Let's talk about a little bit about a supporting kind of connective tissue, and that's called as the cartilage. The cartilage is the cells that lie in small chambers called as the lacunae, and that's lacunae is the term for the lakes. They like it's a little lake that the cells are trapped. That's how the term lacunae arose. So, for example, if I was to draw a cell and a lake, and inside the cell this is the cell, this would be called as the lacunae. So that's why it's called as it has these lacunae, which is a small little chamber, and it's separated by the matrix by the solid yet very flexible region, which would be this region around it. Unfortunately, this cell, that is the cartilage cell, does not get a direct blood supply. So if you have a repair, if you have a tear in the cartilage, it takes for very long for it to heal. There are three types of cartilage that are distinguished by the type of fiber in the matrix. And when you go into 202, you'll talk about those, and those are the hyaline cartilage, the elastic cartilage, and the fibro cartilage. I don't think we need to go. Let me just look up. Did I add that? Yeah, I don't think we're gonna go into the depth of these different kinds of cartilages within that. As long as you know that there are three different kinds of cartilages, and we'll give you examples more in 201 and 202. Now, another kind of connective tissue is the bone. A lot of times it has the word osteo next to it. It's a very rigid connective tissue. It consists of extremely hard salts, or they're inorganic. For example, calcium salts, very prominent in there. And these calcium salts are deposited around proteins or the collagen fibers, and it gives a rigidity and structure to these cells. Here is an image of the compact bone that you can see up here. This last image over here it almost reminds you like a tree ring. The compact bone makes up the shaft of a long bone, as you can see in this image up here. It consists of cylindrical structures that are called as the Avestian systems, and there's a central canal that runs through each osteon, and is surrounded by this hard ring matrix, which is the hard core. The bone cells are located in spaces called as lacunae, again between the rings of the matrix, and the blood vessels in the central cavity allows bone to renew itself. They're again very strong, highly protein component, which forms the fibrous region of the bone. So osteon is is if you ever hear the term osteon, it's got to do with the bones, and you can see this is an osteon by itself, which is a complete structure up here. Structural unit together is an osteon, and then inside is the central canal, which is which is a cylindrical canal that is which sort of is this the central canal is surrounded by osteon. I'm really confusing you up here, but usually if you have a slide of the bone, then it's usually easier to remember. It's got these tree-like structures. The next one is the blood. The blood is it is the cell pore again, because it has a lot of matrix, which is the fibrous and the gel component. There are three different kinds of blood cells: erythrocytes, leukocytes, and the platelets. The erythrocytes are the red blood cells. The leukocytes are the white blood cells, and the platelets are they're not even true cells. They're not complete cells. They're actually fragments of giant cells that are present in the bone marrow. And when a bone marrow vessel is damaged, the platelets forms a clog that seals the vessels. The erythrocytes are the red blood cells that are small, biconcave, disc-shaped cells, and they have no nuclei in them. The presence of the red pigment hemoglobin is very prominent, and we know that hemoglobin is associated with carrying oxygen within the blood system. The white blood cells can be distinguished from the red blood cells, that they're usually larger in size than the red blood cells, and they also have a nucleus in them, and without staining they appear very translucent. Some of the white blood cells are usually phagocytes, and they engulf foreign invasions of pathogens and other such foreign proteins. White blood cells produce antibodies, that molecule that will combat the foreign invasion. So these are all the different kinds of connective tissues. As you can see, there are lots of different kinds up here, not really related to each other. So let's look at the third kind of connective tissue, and those are the muscular tissue. Muscular tissue is always going to correspond to stimulus, so it will either contract and expand, and they always have the term myo, which means myo means myocyte or myoblast, which is the immature or the mature cell. The response to stimulus, for sure. There are three types of muscular tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal tissue are, for example, your biceps, your triceps, your trapezius, your hamstrings, all the voluntary muscular region. It usually contracts when body parts are moving, and it's a voluntary action. They usually skeletal muscles are cylindrical and quite long, and they run in the muscles. So you've got up here skeletal muscles. You can see how parallel they look like. On the other hand, the cardiac is the let's go. The cardiac is up here. The cardiac image that is shown up here. Cardiac cells are they make up the walls of the heart mainly, because they're refined and they're only present in one part of the organ, which is the heart. That's where you only find cardiac cells. My pen's doing a little trouble. Okay, come on. Okay. The cardiac cell contracts as the heart contracts blood and accounts for the movement of the blood. The cardiac muscles also contract and expand accordingly. It's definitely an involuntary movement. And the cardiac cells, I tell students, if you have to recognize a cardiac cell versus a skeletal cell, look for these intercalated discs. The intercalated discs are regions up here that separate an individual cardiac muscles, and this is a region where the plasma membrane actually folds, and this give you these connections, and which are the gap junctions, and these are called as the intercalated discs. So I'm really trying to get this pen to work. Hang on, let me fix it. Okay, I think I got the pen to fix. Now I wanted you to see this region over here, that light region that's shown. This is where the intercalated discs are. These are the connections that are present, and you can recognize these versus skeletal and the smooth muscles. Very easy to find cardiac muscles on a slide if you can find these intercalated discs. The last one is the smooth muscle. The smooth muscles are more spindle shaped. They each have a single nucleus, and they have no striations for sure. You can see up here the skeletal muscles are really striated. Smooth muscles are, as the name gives you, they're smooth. The nuclei will form an irregular pattern in the tissue, and smooth muscles are found in the walls of intestines and stomach and all internal organs. Lots of body cavity and will have these smooth muscles. So this concludes our smooth muscles, and we have one more tissue to do. And this is our last one, which is the nervous tissue. The nervous tissue, it contains nerve cells. These are called as the neurons. And the neurons really have a very different shape than any of the cell that you've done so far. And neurons cannot even be seen under the microscope because a neuron is so large sometimes. A neuron is going to have a specialized cell, which is, it's got three parts. So here is one part of the cell. Here is the other part of the cell, and then there's the last part of the cell. The first part of the cell is called as the cell body. So this is the cell body. Then you have the axons, which are the long filament that is taking the signal from the cell body to the last part, which is called as the dendrites. The dendrites reminds me of a deer. You can see all the spikes that are coming out. Now, a dendrite is a process that conducts signals towards the cell body. So this will release certain transmitters that can be picked up by another cell body over here, and then it will pass on to the axon, to the dendrites, and so forth. So there's a continuous flow of nerve impulse. Now, besides the neuron, the nerve cell also has another kind of cells, which are called as the glial cells. And the glial cells are pretty much cells that supply support and nourishment to the neurons. Sometimes you can just call them as the glial cells or the glia. And the cell body is usually going to be present either in the brain or the spinal cord. And then these fibers or the axons can go from, for example, you can have one fiber starting from the spine all the way to your toe. So you can have a long tissue, which is the axon, and then eventually end in the dendrites. So very different kind of cells than any other kinds of cells. So nerve cells, remember, are called as neurons, and they have fibers or processes. They are called as the axons, and then it ends into the dendrites, and they are supplied by these glial cells. So this concludes all various kinds of tissues that we talked about. Make sure you review this content, because when you go to 201 and 202, you will really be required to know this in possibly 2 to 3 weeks. So I'll show you some slides during class.